Hi, everybody. I'm so glad you're here, and thank you for joining us for Literature Out Loud. And we are featuring the work of Jennifer Egan, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. She has won a, Pulitzer Prize in 2011 for The Goon Squad, and she has won other things more recently. She's very urban. We don't usually do things as New Yorky as this, but we have two women reading today that are absolutely wonderful at handling these things. And we are, as always, extremely indebted to Thunder River Theater, which is, by good fortune, having a wonderful gala tomorrow night at 7 o'clock to raise money, and it's filled with really good performers and good things that you might want to look into. And I might want to say that Morgan, who is reading second today, Morgan Walsh, is a member of the Hudson Reed Ensemble, which has just started this great series called Confluence, which is all about the Roaring Fork Valley, and it's various picadillos, and I just saw the pilot episode, and it's fabulous. So if you don't know anything about that, you need to watch it. I'm telling you. So if you don't, that's up to you, but you should watch that. So we've got the lovely Morgan Walsh tonight, and we also have the incomparable Kathy Markle reading the words of Jennifer Egan. And it's not an easy read, but they're beautifully written, and they're a little edgy. They're not just like walking through the park, but they're like walking through the city. And I think you will enjoy them very much. I'm so pleased to be able to introduce you to these two beautiful readers. And we're going to start out with Kathy reading Found Objects by Jennifer Egan.
Hi. This piece was first published in the New Yorker magazine on December 2nd, 2007. Found Objects, Kleptomaniac and Her Therapist. It began the usual way, in the bathroom of the La Samo Hotel. Sasha was adjusting her yellow eyeshadow in the mirror when she noticed a bag on the floor beside the sink that must have belonged to the woman whose peeing she could faintly hear through the vault-like door of a toilet stall. Inside the rim of the bag, barely visible, was a wallet made of pale green leather. It was easy for Sasha to recognize, looking back, that the peeing woman's blind trust had provoked her. I live in a city where people will steal the hair off your head if you give them half a chance, but you leave your stuff lying in plain sight and expect it to be waiting for you when you come back? It made her want to teach the woman a lesson. But that wish only camouflaged the deeper feeling that Sasha always had, that fat, tender wallet offering itself to her hand. It seemed so dull, so life as usual, just to leave it there rather than seize the moment, accept the challenge, take the leap, fly the coop, throw caution to the wind, live dangerously. I get it, Cause, her therapist said, and take the fucking thing. You mean steal it? He was trying to get Sasha to use that word, which was harder to avoid in the case of a wallet than with a lot of the things she'd lifted over the past year, when her condition, as Cause referred to it, had begun to accelerate. 5 sets of keys, 14 pairs of sunglasses, a child-striped scarf, binoculars, a cheese grater, a pocket knife, 28 bars of soap, 85 pens, ranging from cheap ballpoints she'd used to sign debit card slips, to the aubergine Visconti that cost $260 online, which she had lifted from her former boss's lawyer during a contracts meeting. Sasha never took anything from stores. Their cold, inert goods didn't tempt her, only from people. Okay, she said, steal it. Sasha and Kaz had dubbed that feeling she got the personal challenge, as in taking the wallet was a way for Sasha to assert her toughness, her individuality. What they needed to do was switch things around in her head so that the challenge became not taking the wallet, but leaving it. That would be the cure, although Kaz never used words like cure. He wore funky sweaters and let her call him Kaz, but he was old school and inscrutable, to the point where Sasha couldn't tell if he was gay or straight, if he'd written famous books, or if, as she sometimes suspected, he was one of those escaped cons who impersonate surgeons and wind up leaving their operating tools inside people's skulls. Of course, these questions could have been resolved on Google in less than a minute, but they were useful questions, according to Kaz, and so far Sasha had resisted. The couch where she lay in his office was blue leather and very soft. Kaz liked the couch, he'd told her, because it relieved both of them of the burden of eye contact. You don't like eye contact? Sasha had asked. It had seemed like a weird thing for a therapist to admit. I find it tiring, he'd said. This way we can both look where we want. Where will you look? He smiled. You can see my options. Where do you usually look when people are on the couch? Around the room, Kaz said. At the ceiling, into space. Do you ever sleep? No. Sasha usually looked at the window which faced the street, and tonight, as she continued her story, was rippled with rain. She'd glimpsed the wallet, tender and overripe as a peach. She'd plucked it from the woman's bag and slipped it into her own small handbag, which she'd zipped shut even before the sound of peeing had stopped. She'd flicked open the bathroom door and floated back through the lobby to the bar. She and the wallet's owner had never seen each other. Pre-wallet, Sasha had been in the grip of a dire evening. Lame date, yet another, brooding behind dark bangs, sometimes glancing at the flat-screen TV where a Jets game seemed to interest him more than Sasha's admittedly worn-out tales of Benny Salazar, her old boss, who ran a record label and also, Sasha happened to know, sprinkled gold flakes into his coffee, as an aphrodisiac, she suspected, and sprayed pesticide in his armpits. Post-wallet, however, the scene tingled with mirthful possibility. Sasha felt the waiters eyeing her as she sidled back to the table, holding her handbag with its secret weight. She sat down and took a sip of her melon madness martini and cocked her head at Alex. She smiled her yes-no smile, remote yet flirtatious, quizzical yet penetrating, a smile she could muster only at certain lucky times. Hello, she said. The yes-no smile was amazingly effective. You're happy, Alex said. I'm always happy, Sasha said. Sometimes I just forget. Alex had paid the bill while she was in the bathroom, clear proof that he'd been on the verge of aborting their date. Now he studied her. You feel like going somewhere else? They stood. Alex wore black cords and a white button-down shirt. He was a legal secretary. On email, he'd been fanciful, almost goofy, but in person, he seemed simultaneously anxious and bored. She could tell that he was in excellent shape, not because he went to the gym, but because he was young enough that his body was still imprinted with whatever sports he'd played in high school and college. Sasha, who was 35, had passed that point. Still, not even Kaz knew her real age. The closest anyone had come to guessing it was 31, and most put her in her 20s. She worked out daily and avoided the sun. Her online profiles all listed her as 28. As Sasha followed Alex from the bar, she couldn't resist unzipping her purse and touching the fat green wallet just for a second, for the contraction it made her feel around her heart. You're aware of how the theft makes you feel, Kaz said, to the point where you remind yourself of it to improve your mood. But do you think about how it makes the other person feel? Sasha tipped her head back to look at him. She made a point of doing this now and then just to remind Kaz that she wasn't an idiot. She knew that the question had a right answer. She and Kaz were collaborators, writing a story whose end had already been determined. She would get well. She would stop stealing from people and start caring again about the things that had once guided her: music, the network of friends she'd made when she first came to New York, a set of goals she'd scrawled on a big sheet of newsprint taped to the walls of her early apartments. Find a band to manage, understand the news, study Japanese, learn the harp. I don't think about the people, Sasha said. But it isn't that you lack empathy, Kaz said. We know that because of the plumber. Sasha sighed. She told Kaz the plumber's story about a month ago, and he'd found a way to bring it up almost every session since. The plumber was an old man sent by Sasha's landlord to investigate a leak in the apartment below hers. He'd appeared in Sasha's doorway, tufts of gray on his head, and within a minute, boom, he'd hit the floor and crawled under her bathtub like an animal fumbling its way into a familiar hole. The fingers he'd groped toward the bolts behind the tub were grimed to cigar stubs, and reaching made his sweatshirt hike up, exposing a soft white back. Sasha turned away, stricken by the old man's abasement, anxious to leave for her temp job, except that the plumber was talking to her, asking about the length and frequency of her showers. I never use it, she told him curtly. I shower at the gym. He nodded without acknowledging her rudeness, apparently used to it. Sasha's nose began to prickle. She shut her eyes and pushed hard on both temples. Opening her eyes, she saw the plumber's tool belt lying on the floor at her feet. It had a beautiful screwdriver in it, the orange translucent handle gleaming like a lollipop in its worn leather loop, the silvery shaft sculpted, sparkling. Sasha felt herself contract around the object in a single yawn of appetite. She needed to hold the screwdriver just for a minute. She bent her knees and plucked it noiselessly from the belt. Not a bangle jangled. Her bony hands were spastic at most things, but she was good at this. Made for it, she often thought, in the first drifty moments after lifting something. And once the screwdriver was in her hand, she felt instant relief from the pain of having an old soft-backed man snuffling under her tub. And then something more than relief, a blessed indifference, as if the very idea of feeling pain over such a thing were baffling. And what about after he'd gone? Kaz had asked when Sasha told him the story. How did the screwdriver look to you then? There was a pause. Normal, she said. Really? Not special anymore? Like any screwdriver. Sasha had heard Kaz shift behind her and felt something happen in the room. The screwdriver, which she'd placed on the table, recently supplemented with a second table, where she kept the things she'd lifted and which she'd barely looked at since, seemed to hang in the air of Kaz's office. It floated between them, a symbol. And how did you feel, Kaz asked quietly, about having taken it from the plumber you pitied? How did she feel? How did she feel? There was a right answer, of course. At times, Sasha had to fight the urge to lie simply as a way of depriving Kaz of it. Bad, she said. Okay, I felt bad. Shit, I'm bankrupting myself to pay for you. Obviously, I get it that this isn't a great way to live. More than once, Kaz had tried to connect the plumber to Sasha's father, who had disappeared when she was 6. She was careful not to indulge this line of thinking. I don't remember him, she told Kaz. I have nothing to say. She did this for Kaz's protection and her own, but they were writing a story of redemption, of fresh beginnings and second chances. But in that direction lay only sorrow. Sasha and Alex crossed the lobby of the Lassimo Hotel. Sasha hugged her purse to her shoulder, the warm ball of wallet snuggled in her armpit. As they passed the angular budded branches by the big glass doors to the street, a woman zigzagged into their path. Wait, she said, you haven't seen. I'm desperate. Sasha felt a twang of terror. It was the woman whose wallet she'd taken. She knew this instantly, although the person before her had nothing in common with the blithe, raven-haired wallet owner she'd pictured. This woman had vulnerable brown eyes and flat, pointy shoes that clicked too loudly on the marble floor. There was plenty of gray in her frizzy brown hair. Sasha took Alex's arm, trying to steer him through the doors. She felt his pulse of surprise at her touch, but he stayed put. "Have we seen what?" he said. "Someone stole my wallet. My ID is gone, and I have to catch a plane tomorrow morning. I'm just desperate." She stared beseechingly at both of them. It was the sort of frank need that New Yorkers quickly learn how to hide, and Sasha recoiled. It had never occurred to her that the woman was from out of town. "Have you called the police?" Alex asked. "The concierge said he would call, but I'm also wondering, could it have fallen out somewhere?" She looked helplessly at the floor around their feet. Sasha relaxed slightly. This woman was the type who annoyed people without meaning to. Apology shadowed her movements even now as she followed Alex to the concierge's desk. Sasha trailed behind. "Is someone helping this person?" she heard Alex ask. The concierge was young and spiky-haired. "We've called the police," he said defensively. Alex turned to the woman. "Where did this happen?" "In the ladies' room, I think." "Who else was there?" "No one." "It was empty?" "Well, there might have been someone, but I didn't see her." Alex swung around to Sasha. "You were just in the bathroom. Did you see anyone?" "No," she managed to say. She had some Xanax in her purse, but she couldn't open her purse. Even with it zipped, she feared that the wallet would blurt into view in some way that she couldn't control, unleashing a cascade of horrors: arrest, shame, poverty, death. Alex turned to the concierge. "How come I'm asking these questions instead of you?" He said. "Someone just got robbed in your hotel. Don't you have, security?" The words "robbed" and "security" managed to pierce the soothing backbeat that pumped through not just the L'Ossimo, but every hotel like it in New York. There was a mild ripple of interest from the lobby. "I've called security," the concierge said, adjusting his neck. "I'll call them again." Sasha glanced at Alex. He was angry, and the anger made him recognizable in a way that an hour of aimless chatter, mostly hers, it was true, had not. He was new to New York. He came from someplace smaller. He had a thing or two to prove about how people should treat one another. Two security guys showed up, same on TV and in life. Beefy guys whose scrupulous politeness was somehow linked to their willingness to crack skulls. They dispersed to search the bar. Sasha wished feverishly that she'd left the wallet there, as if this were an impulse she'd barely resisted. "I'll check the bathroom," she told Alex, and forced herself to walk slowly around the elevator bank. The bathroom was empty. Sasha opened her purse, took out the wallet, unearthed her vial of Xanax, and popped one between her teeth. They worked faster if you chewed them. As the caustic taste flooded her mouth, she scanned the room, trying to decide where to ditch the wallet. In the stall, under the sink. The decision paralyzed her. She had to do this right, to emerge unscathed. And if she did, she had a frenzied sense of making a promise to cause. The bathroom door opened, and the woman walked in. Her frantic eyes met Sasha's in the bathroom mirror. Narrow, green, equally frantic. There was a pause, during which Sasha felt that she was being confronted. The woman had known all along. Sasha handed her the wallet. She saw from the woman's stunned expression that she was wrong. "I'm sorry," Sasha said quickly. "It's a problem I have." The woman opened the wallet. Her physical relief at having it back coursed through Sasha in a warm rush, as if their bodies had fused. "Everything's there, I swear," she said. "I didn't even open it. It's this problem I have, but I'm getting help. Please don't tell. I'm hanging on by a thread." The woman glanced up, her soft brown eyes moving over Sasha's face. What did she see? Sasha wished that she could turn and peer in the mirror again, as if something about herself might at last be revealed, some lost thing. But she didn't turn. She held still and let the woman look. It struck her that the woman was close to her own age, her real age. She probably had children at home. "Okay," the woman said, looking down. "It's between us." Thank you, Sasha said. Thank you, thank you. Relief and the first gentle waves of Xanax made her feel faint, and she leaned against the wall. She sensed the woman's eagerness to get away. She had an urge to slide to the floor. There was a rap on the door, a man's voice. Any luck? Sasha and Alex left the hotel and stepped into desolate, windy Tribeca. She was tired of him. In a mere 20 minutes, they'd blown past the point of meaningful connection through shared experience into the less appealing state of knowing each other too well. Alex wore a knit cap pulled over his forehead. His eyelashes were long and black. That was weird, he said finally. Yeah, Sasha said. Then after a pause, you mean finding it? The whole thing, but yeah. He turned to her. Was it like concealed from view? It was lying on the floor in the corner, kind of behind a planter. The utterance of this lie caused tiny pinpricks of sweat to emerge on Sasha's Xanax soothed skull. She considered saying, actually, there was no planter, but managed not to. It's almost like she did it on purpose, Alex said, for attention or something. She didn't seem like that type. Well, you can't tell. There's something I'm learning here in NYC. You have no fucking idea what people are really like. It's not even that they're two-faced. They're like multiple personalities. She wasn't from New York, Sasha said, irked by his obliviousness, even as she sought to preserve it. Remember, she was getting on a plane. True, Alex said. He paused and cocked his head, regarding Sasha across the ill-lit sidewalk. But you know what I'm talking about, the thing about people. I do know, she said carefully, but I think you get used to it. I'd rather just go somewhere else. It took Sasha a moment to understand. There is nowhere else, she said. Alex turned to her, startled. Then he grinned. Sasha grinned back, not the yes-no smile, but related. That's ridiculous, Alex said. They took a cab and climbed the 4 flights to Sasha's Lower East Side walk-up. She'd lived there for 6 years. The place smelled of scented candles, and there was a velvet throw cloth on her sofa bed, and lots of pillows, and an old color TV with a very good picture, and an array of souvenirs from her travels lining the windowsills. A white seashell, a pair of red dice, a small canister of tiger balm from Singapore, now dried to the texture of rubber, a tiny bonsai tree that she watered faithfully. Look at this, Alex said. You've got a tub in the kitchen. I've heard of that. I mean, I've read about it, but I wasn't sure there were any left. The shower part is new, right? This is a bathtub in the kitchen apartment, right? Yep, Sasha said, but I almost never use it. I shower at the gym. The tub was covered with a fitted board. Sasha kept her plates stacked on top of it. Alex ran his hands around the rim of the bath and examined its clawed feet. Sasha took a bottle of grappa from the kitchen cupboard and filled 2 small glasses. I love this place, Alex said. It feels like old New York. This stuff is around, but how do you find it? Sasha leaned against the tub beside him and took a tiny sip of grappa. She was trying to remember Alex's age on his profile. 28, she thought, but he seemed younger than that, maybe a lot younger. She saw her apartment as he must see it, a flash of local color that would fade almost instantly into the swirl of adventure that everyone has on first coming to New York. It jarred Sasha to think of herself as a glint in the hazy memories that Alex would struggle to organize a year or 2 from now. Where was that place with the bathtub? Who was that girl? He left the tub to explore the rest of the apartment. To one side of the kitchen was Sasha's bedroom. On the other side, facing the street, was her living room den office, which contained 2 upholstered chairs and the desk she reserved for special projects outside of work. Publicity for bands she believed in, short reviews for Vibe and Spin, although those have fallen off sharply in recent years. In fact, the whole apartment, which 6 years ago had seemed like a way station to some better place, had ended up solidifying around Sasha, gathering mass and weight, until she felt both mired in it and lucky to have it, as if she not only couldn't move on but didn't want to. Alex leaned over to peer at the tiny collection on Sasha's windowsills. He hadn't noticed the tables where she kept the pile of things she'd stolen: the pens, the binoculars, the keys, the child's scarf, which she'd lifted simply by not returning it when it dropped from a little girl's neck as her mother led her by the hand from a Starbucks. Sasha was already seeing cause by then, so she recognized the litany of excuses even as they throbbed through her head. Winter is almost over. Children grow so fast. Kids hate scarves. It's too late. They're out the door. I'm embarrassed to return it. I could easily not have seen it fall. In fact, I didn't. I'm just noticing it now. Look, a scarf. A kid's bright yellow scarf with pink stripes. Too bad. Who could it belong to? Well, I'll just pick it up and hold it for a minute. At home, she'd washed the scarf by hand and folded it neatly. It was one of the things she liked best. "What's all this?" Alex asked. He'd discovered the tables now and was staring at the pile. It looked like the work of a miniaturist beaver, a heap of objects that was illegible yet clearly not random. To Sasha's eye, it almost shook under its load of embarrassments and close shaves and little triumphs and moments of pure exhilaration. It contained years of her life compressed. The screwdriver was at the outer edge. Sasha moved closer to Alex, drawn to the sight of him taking everything in. "And how did you feel standing with Alex in front of all those things you'd stolen?" Kaz asked. Sasha turned her face into the blue couch because her cheeks were heating up and she hated that. She didn't want to explain to Kaz the mix of feelings she'd had standing there with Alex, the pride she took in these objects, a tenderness that was only heightened by the shame of their acquisition. She'd risked everything, and here was the result, the raw, warped core of her life. Watching Alex move his eyes over the pile of objects stirred something in Sasha. She put her arms around him from behind, and he turned, surprised but willing. She kissed him full on the mouth, then undid a zipper and kicked off her boots. Alex tried to lead her toward the other room where they could lie down on the sofa bed, but Sasha dropped to her knees beside the tables and pulled him down, the Persian carpet prickling her back, streetlight falling through the window onto his hungry, hopeful face, his bare white thighs. Afterward, they lay on the rug for a long time. The candles started to sputter. Sasha saw the prickly shape of the bonsai silhouetted against the window near her head. All her excitement had seeped away, leaving behind a terrible sadness, an emptiness that felt violent, as if she'd been gouged. She tottered to her feet, hoping that Alex would leave soon. He still had his shirt on. "You know what I feel like doing?" he said, standing up. "Taking a bath in that tub." "You can," Sasha said dully. "It works. The plumber was just here." She pulled up her jeans and collapsed onto a chair. Alex went to the tub and lifted off the cover. Water gushed from the faucet. Its force had always startled Sasha the few times she'd used it. Alex's black pants were crumpled on the floor at Sasha's feet. The square of his wallet had worn away the corduroy from one of the back pockets, as if he often wore those pants, and always with the wallet in that place. Sasha glanced over at him. Steam rose from the tub as he dipped in a hand to test the water. Then he came back to the pile of objects and leaned close, as if looking for something specific. Sasha watched him, hoping for a tremor of the excitement she'd felt before, but it was gone. "Can I put in some of these?" He was holding up a packet of bath salts that Sasha had taken from her best friend Lizzie a couple of years ago, before they'd stopped speaking. The salts were still in their polka dot wrapping. They'd been deep in the middle of the pile, which had collapsed a little from the extraction. How had Alex even seen them? Sasha hesitated. She and Kaz had talked at length about why she kept the stolen objects separate from the rest of her life, because using them would imply greed or self-interest, because leaving them untouched made it seem as if she might one day give them back, because piling them in a heap kept their power from leaking away. "I guess," she said, "I guess you can." She was aware of having made a move in the story that she and Kaz were writing, of having taken a symbolic step, but toward the happy ending or away from it. She felt Alex's hand on the back of her head stroking her hair. "You like it hot?" he asked, "or medium?" Hot, she said. Really, really hot. Me too. He went back to the tub and fiddled with the knobs and shook in some of the salts, and the room instantly filled with a steamy plant-like odor that was deeply familiar to Sasha. The smell of Lizzie's bathroom from the days when Sasha used to shower there after she and Lizzie went running together in Central Park. "Where are your towels?" Alex called. She kept them folded in a basket in the bathroom. Alex went to get them, then shut the bathroom door. Sasha heard him starting to pee. She knelt on the floor and slipped his wallet from his pants pocket and opened it, her heart firing with a sudden pressure. It was a plain black wallet, worn to gray along the edges. Rapidly, she flicked among its contents: a debit card, a work ID, a gym card. In a side pocket, a faded picture of two boys and a girl in braces squinting on a beach. A sports team in yellow uniforms, heads so small she couldn't tell if one of them belonged to Alex. From among these dog-eared photos, a scrap of binder paper dropped into Sasha's lap. It looked very old, the edges torn, the pale blue lines rubbed almost away. Sasha unfolded it and saw written in blunt pencil, "I believe in you." She froze, staring at the words. They seemed to tunnel toward her from their meager scrap, bringing a flush of embarrassment for Alex, who'd kept this disintegrating tribute in his disintegrating wallet, and then shame at herself for having looked at it. She was faintly aware of the faucet being turned on and of the need to move quickly. Hastily, mechanically, she reassembled the wallet, keeping the slip of paper in her hand. "I'm just going to hold this," she was aware of telling herself, as she tucked the wallet back into Alex's pocket. "I'll put it back later. He probably doesn't remember it's in there. I'll actually be doing him a favor by getting it out of the way before someone finds it. I'll say, 'Hey, I noticed this on the rug. Is it yours?' And he'll say, 'That? I've never seen it before. It must be yours, Sasha.' And maybe that's true. Maybe someone gave it to me years ago and I forgot." "And did you put it back?" Kaz asked. "I didn't have a chance. He came out of the bathroom." "And what about later, after the bath? Or the next time you saw him?" "After the bath, he put on his pants and left. I haven't talked to him since." There was a pause during which Sasha was keenly aware of Kaz behind her, waiting. She wanted badly to please him, to say something like, "It was a turning point. Everything feels different now." Or, "I called Lizzie and we finally made up." Or, "I've picked up the harp again." Or just, "I'm changing. I'm changing. I'm changing. I've changed." Redemption, transformation. God, how she wanted these things every day, every minute. Didn't everyone? "Please," she told Kaz, "don't ask me how I feel." "All right," he said quietly. They sat in silence, the longest silence that had ever passed between them. Sasha looked at the window pane rinsed with rain, smearing lights in the falling dark. She lay with her body tensed, claiming the couch, her spot in this room, her view of the window and the walls, the faint hum that was always there when she listened, and these minutes of Kaz's time. Another, then another, then one more.
Hi, my name's Morgan Walsh, and I'm reading Emerald City, which is from the first collection of short stories that was published in 1996 by Jennifer Egan. Rory knew before he came to New York what sort of life he would have. He'd read about it in novels by hip young authors who lived there. He saw the apartment, small but high-ceilinged, a tall, sooty window with a fire escape twisting past a chemical pink sky. Nights in frantic clubs, mornings hunched over coffee in the East Village, warming his hands on the cup. Black pants, black turtleneck, pointed black boots. He intended to snort cocaine, but by the time he arrived, that was out. He drank instead. He was a photographer's assistant, loading cameras all day, holding up light meters, waving Polaroids until they were dry enough to tear open. As he watched the models move, He sometimes worried he was still too California. What could you do with sandy blonde hair? Cut it off? Short hair was on the wane, at least for men. So there it hung, golden, straight as paper, reminiscent of the beaches he'd never seen, being as he was from Chicago. In Chicago, there was a lake, but that didn't count. His other option was to gain or lose some weight, but the starved look had lost its appeal. Any suggestion of illness was to be avoided. Beefy was the way to go. Not fat, just a classic paunch above the belt. But no matter how much Rory ate, he stayed exactly the same. He took up smoking instead, even though it burned his throat. Rory stubbed out his cigarette and checked to make sure the lights were off in the darkroom. He was always the last to leave. His boss, Vesuvi, would hand him the camera as soon as the last shot was done, and then swan out through the sea of film containers, plastic cups, and discarded sheets of backdrop paper. Vesuvi was one of those people who always had somewhere to go. He was blessed with a marvelous paunch, which Rory tried not to admire too openly. He didn't want Vesuvi to get the wrong idea. Rory swept the debris into the bags. Then he turned out the lights, locked up the studio, and headed down to the street. Twilight was his favorite hour. Metal gates sliding down over storefronts, newspapers whirling from the sidewalk into the sky, an air of promise and abandonment. This was the way he'd expected New York to look, and he was thrilled when the city complied. He took the subway down to visit Stacy, a failing model who he adored against all reason. Stacy, when girls with names like Zane and Anushka and Brid regularly slipped him their phone numbers during shoots. Stacy refused to change her name. "If I make it," she said, "they'll be happy to call me whatever." She never acknowledged that she was failing, though it was obvious. Rory longed to bring it up, to talk it over with her, but he was afraid to. Stacy lay on her bed, shoes still on. A Diet Coke was on the table beside her. She weighed herself each morning, and when she was under 120, she allowed herself a real Coke that day. "What happened at Bazaar?" Rory asked, perching on the edge of the bed. Stacy sat up and smoothed her hair. "The usual," she said. "I'm too commercial." She shrugged, but Rory could see she was troubled. "And that was nothing," Stacy continued. "On my next go-see, the guy kept looking at me and flipping back and forth through my book. And of course I'm thinking, fantastic, he's going to hire me. So you know what he finally says? I'm not ugly enough."
Beauty today is ugly beauty. Look at those girls. They're monsters, gorgeous, mythical monsters. If a girl isn't ugly, I won't use her. She turned to Rory. He saw tears in her eyes and felt helpless. "What a bastard," he said. To his surprise, she began to laugh. She lay back on the bed and let the laughter shake her. "I mean, here I am," she said, "killing myself to stay thin, hot oiling my hair, getting my nails done, and what does he tell me? I'm not ugly enough?"
It's crazy," Rory said, watching Stacy uneasily. "He's out of his mind." She sat up and rubbed her eyes. She looked slap-happy the way she sometimes did after a second gin and tonic. 8 months before, after a year's meticulous planning, she had bought her own ticket to New York from Cincinnati, and this was just the beginning. Stacy hoped to ride the wave of her success around the world. Paris, Tokyo, London, Bangkok. The shelves of her tiny apartment were cluttered with maps and travel books, and whenever she met a foreigner, it made no difference from where, she would carefully copy his address into a small leather-bound book, convinced it would not be long before she was everywhere. She was the sort of girl for whom Nothing happened by accident. And it pained Rory to watch her struggle when all day in Vesuvi's studio he saw girls whose lives were accident upon accident, from their discovery in whatever shopping mall or hot dog stand to the startling, gaudy error of their faces. "Rory," Stacy said, "look at me a minute." He turned obediently. She was so close, he could smell the warm, milky lotion she used on her face. "Do you ever wish I was uglier?" she asked. "God, no," Rory said, pulling away to see if she was joking. "What a question, Stace." "Come on, you do this all day long." She moved close to him again, and Rory found himself looking at the tiny pores on either side of her nose. He tried to think of the studio and the girls there, but when he concentrated on Stacy, they disappeared. And when he thought of the studio, he couldn't see Stacy anymore. It was a world she didn't belong to. As he watched Stacy's tense, expectant face, Rory felt a dreadful power. It would take so little, he thought, to crush her. "Never mind," she said when Rory didn't answer. "I don't want to know." She stood and crossed the room, then leaned over and pressed her palms to the floor. She had been a gymnast in high school and was still remarkably limber. The limberness delighted Rory in a way that almost shamed him. In bed, she would sit up, legs straight out in front of her, then lean over and rest her cheek against her shins, casually, as if it were nothing. Rory didn't dare tell her how this excited him. If she were aware of it, then it wouldn't be the same. Stacy stood up, flushed and peaceful again. "Let's get out of here," she said. Her apartment was right off of Columbus, a street Rory scorned, but one that nevertheless mesmerized him. He and Stacy walked arm in arm, peering into the windows of restaurants as eagerly as diners peered out of them. It was as if they had all been told some friend might pass this way tonight and were keeping their eyes peeled. "Where should we go?" Stacy asked. Rory cracked his knuckles one by one. The question made him edgy, as if there were some right answer he should know. Where were the people who mattered? Occasionally, Rory would be stricken with a sense that they had been exactly where he was only moments before, but had just left. The worst part was he didn't know who they were exactly. The closest he came was in knowing people who seemed to know. His roommate Charles, a food stylist who specialized in dollops, and of course Vesuvi. Vesuvi was his main source. They headed downtown, enjoying the last warm days of fall, the pleasant seediness of 7th Avenue. They passed intersections where patches of old cobblestones were exposed beneath layers of tar, relics of another New York, Rory dimly remembered from novels, carriages and top hats, reputations and insults. "Rory," Stacy said, "do you feel something more now that you've gotten successful?" Rory turned to her in surprise. "Who says I'm successful?" "But you are." "I'm no one. I'm Vesuvi's assistant." Stacy seemed shocked. "That's not no one," she said. Rory grinned. It was a funny conversation. "Yeah," he said. "Then who is it?" Stacy pondered this a moment. Suddenly she laughed, the same helpless way she had laughed on the bed, as if the world were funny by accident. Still laughing, she said, "Vesuvi's assistant." At Stacy's suggestion, they took a cab to a Tribeca bistro where Vesuvi often went. It was probably expensive, but Rory had just been paid. What the hell? He'd buy Stacy dinner. Maybe he would even call Charles to see if he was back from LA, where he'd been styling all week for Sarah Lee. Rory didn't envy Charles's job, although he made good money. Sometimes he was up half the night using tweezers to paste sesame seeds onto hamburger buns, or mixing and coloring the salty dough that looked like ice cream in pictures more than real ice cream did. Rory had been amazed to learn that in breakfast cereal shots, it was standard to use Elmer's glue instead of milk. "It's whiter," Charles said. Also, it pours more slowly and doesn't soak the flakes. Rory had found this disturbing in a way he didn't quite understand. Inside the restaurant, Rory spotted Vesuvi himself at a large round table in the back. Or rather, Vesuvi spotted him and called out with a heartiness that could only mean he was bored with his present company. With a grand sweep of his arm, he beckoned them over. The waiters pulled up chairs, and Rory and Stacy sat down. Stacy ordered a gin and tonic. Rory could see she was nervous. The girls at the table were faces you saw around a lot. Red-headed Daphne, Inga with her guppy face, others whose names he'd forgotten. What distressed him was seeing Anushka, a moody girl whose journey from some dour Siberian town to the height of New York fashion seemed to have happened in an afternoon. Once she had lingered at the studio where Rory cleaned up after work, humming a Fine Young Cannibals song and flipping aimlessly through his copy of The Great Gatsby. "My father is a professor," she told him. "He teaches this book." "In Russian?" Rory asked incredulously. Anushka laughed. "Sure," she said, curling the word in her accent. "Why not?" Outside the studio, Rory and Anushka had hovered uncertainly in the dusk. Rory was supposed to meet Stacy, but felt awkward saying so to Anushka. Instead, he blundered forward and hailed a cab, leaving Anushka standing on the curb, then paid the driver 3 blocks later and took the subway to Stacy's. He arrived shaking, mystified by his own idiotic behavior. Anushka had frightened him ever since. Last week, while he was loading Vesuvi's camera, she had casually reported the numerical value of her IQ, then subjected him to a humiliating quiz on the great books. "Have you read much Dostoevsky?" she called up the rickety ladder where Rory was grappling with a light. "The brother Karamazov? No? What about War and Peace?" When Rory called back down that War and Peace was by Tolstoy, Anushka colored deeply, stalked back onto the set, and did not speak to him again. Rory felt terrible. He'd never read a word of War and Peace. He even considered confessing this to Anushka after the shoot as she grumpily gathered her things. But what the hell, he decided. Let her think he's brilliant. Now Rory looked at Vesuvi, sprawled amid the models, sphinx-like, olive-skinned, his close-cropped beard peppered with gray, though his wild curly hair showed no sign of it. He was short and wore high-heeled boots that Rory found spectacular. Vesuvi was a man of few words, yet he often gave the impression of being on the verge of speech. Conversation would precede him tentatively, ready to be swept aside at any moment by whatever Vesuvi might say. Rory watched him adoringly over his glass of bourbon, unable to believe that he was sitting with Vesuvi after all the times he had watched him glide away in cabs, feeling as if most of what mattered in the world were disappearing with him. Yet Rory wasn't entirely happy. Everyone at the table was watching him, especially Anushka, and he felt that in return for being included, he was expected to do something stunning. He glanced at the next table where conversation seemed more lively. It was a group of downtown types, men like deposed medieval kings and their bobbed haircuts and gigantic silver medallions. During his first month in New York, Rory had gone out with a girl like the ones at that table. Dave, she called herself. She wore nothing but black. Bulky sweaters, short loose skirts, woolen tights, and round-toed combat boots. The thrill of the relationship for Rory lay mostly in watching Dave undress. There was something tremendous in the sight of her slender white form emerging from all that darkness. Once she finished undressing, Rory often wished she would put part of the outfit back on, or better yet, dress completely again and start over. Vesuvi was eyeing Stacy. "You look familiar," he said. "Did I use you for something?" "Once," she said, 4.5 months ago. "Right, I remember now. It was that..." He waved a languid hand, which meant he had no idea. For Elle, Stacy said, bow ties. It had been her best job, and she was crushed when the pictures the magazine printed had failed to include her head. To use them in her book would look desperate, her agent said, so she kept them pasted to her bathroom mirror. Rory looked at them while he was shaving. Vesuvius sat back, satisfied. The question of whether he had worked with a girl always troubled him, Rory had noticed, as if the world were divided between girls he shot and girls he hadn't, and not knowing which side a girl was on caused a cosmic instability. You worked for Elle? Anushka asked Stacy. Once, Stacy said. So far, Rory quickly added. Anushka glanced at him and then at Stacy with the same startled look she'd worn when Rory left her on the curb. He felt guilty all over again. You must have worked for them too, Stacy said to Anushka, who nodded absently. I heard you got a cover, someone said. Yes, Anushka said dully. Then she seemed to take heart as if hearing this news for the first time. Yes, she said, grinning suddenly. I am the cover for December. Rory felt Stacy move in her chair. Anushka lit a cigarette and smoked, exotic, dragon-like, and her black hair tumbling past her shoulders. For a moment, all of them watched her, and against his will, even Rory was moved by a face so familiar from pictures. Never mind what you thought of Anushka, she was that woman. You recognized her. There was an odd pleasure in this, like finding something you've been looking for. When do you leave for Tokyo? Anushka asked Inga. Next week, Inga said. Have you been? 2 years ago, Anushka said in her heavy accent. It's okay. But when you take the morning airplanes, you see the Japanese men are coughing their lungs into trash cans. They smoke like crazy, she concluded, wagging her cigarette between two fingers. Rory listened miserably. Poor Stacy was barely surviving in New York, and here was Anushka, who had not only been to Japan, but had the luxury of complaining about it. He rattled the ice in his glass and impatiently cleared his throat. Anushka glanced at him and turned serious. Still, she said, the culture of Japan is quite important. The culture, Inga said. You know, the museums and this sort of thing. Vesuvi, who had seemed on the verge of sleep, roused himself and turned to Anushka. You, inside a museum, he said. That I don't see. The girl looked startled. You must have been there on location, he said. Not location. I went for fun. How do you know what I do? Vesuvi shrugged and sat back in his chair, his lazy eyes filled with amusement. Anushka blushed to the neck. The pink tinge seemed at odds with her extravagant face. Helplessly, she turned to Stacy. You have been to Japan? She asked. I wish. But Milano, yes? No, Stacy said, and Rory noticed with surprise that her drink was almost gone. Normally one cocktail would last Stacy an entire night. Her sips were so tiny. Paris? Stacy shook her head, and Rory noticed a change in Anushka's face as she sensed her advantage. The others were quiet. Vesuvius sat forward, looking from Anushka to Stacy with great interest, as if they were posing for him. You never worked in Paris? I think everyone has worked in Paris. I've never been to Paris, Stacy said. London? Munich? Anushka turned to the other girls, confirming her surprise. Though she didn't glance at Rory, he sensed that all of this was meant for him and felt a strange, guilty collusion with her. He saw Stacy's hand shake as she lifted her glass and was overcome with a sudden and absolute hatred for Anushka. He had never hated anyone this way. He stared at her, the gush of hair, the bruised-looking mouth. She was as ugly as the man had said today. Ugly and beautiful. Confused, Rory looked away. So, Anushka said, what places have you been? Stacy didn't answer at first. She looked double-jointed in her chair, heaped like a marionette. I have been to New York, she said. There was a beat of silence. New York, Anushka said. Vesuvi began to laugh. He had a loud, explosive laugh that startled Rory at first. He had never heard it before. New York! Vesuvi cried, that's priceless! Stacy smiled. She seemed as surprised as everyone else. Vesuvi rocked forward in his chair so that his heavy boots pounded on the floor. I love it, he said. New York! What a perfect comeback! Anushka just stared at him. It began to seem very funny all of a sudden. A chuckle passed through the group like a current. Rory found himself laughing without knowing why. It was enough for him that Vesuvi had a reason. His boss gazed at Stacy in the soft-eyed way he'd looked at models when a shoot was going well. It's a hell of a place, New York, he said. No? But she has only gone here, Anusha protested. How does she know? Oh, she knows, Rory said. He felt reckless, dizzy with the urge to make Anushka angry. You don't get it, do you? He said. What can I get when there is nothing? She retorted. But she looked uncertain. Vesuvi dabbed with a napkin at his heavy-lidded eyes. Next time you go to New York, he told Stacy, take me with you. This was too much for Anushka. Fuck you, she cried, jumping to her feet. I am in New York. You are in New York. Here is New York. But the laughter had seized the table, and Anushka's protests only made it worse. She stood helplessly while everyone laughed, Rory hooting all the louder to keep her in her place. That's it, she said. Goodbye. Go back to Japan, Rory cried. He had trouble catching his breath. Anushka fixed her eyes on him. Her makeup made them look burned at the rims, and the irises were a bright, clear green. He thought she might do something crazy. He'd heard once she'd punctured an ex-boyfriend's upper lip by hurling a fork at him. He stopped laughing and gripped the table's edge, poised for sudden movement. To his astonishment, the charred-looking eyes filled with tears. I hate you, Rory, she said. She yanked her bag from under the table and hoisted it onto her shoulder. Her long hair stuck to her wet cheeks as she struggled to free her jacket from the chair. Rory thought of his high school lunchroom, girls stalking out, mad, clattering trays, their long, skinny legs skittering on high-heeled shoes. He felt a pang of nostalgia. She was just a kid. Anushka, so much younger than he was. Hey, Vesuvi said, standing and putting his arms around Anushka. Hey, we were just having a joke. Go to hell with your joke, she said, turning her face away so that no one could see her crying. Vesuvi stroked her back. Hey now, he said. Chastened, the group sat in guilty silence. Stacy and Rory traded a look and stood up. No one protested as they slid their jackets on, but when Rory opened his wallet to pay for their drinks, Vesuvi winced and waved it away. Anushka still clung to him, her face buried in his neck. Vesuvi spoke to Stacy in a lowered voice. I've got something coming up you'd be perfect for, he said. Who are you with again? Stacy told him the name of her agency, barely able to contain her joy. Rory listened unhappily. Vesuvi said this all the time to girls and forgot the next minute. It was just a pleasant salutation. They left the restaurant and headed down toward the East Village. Rory longed to reach for Stacy's hand, but she seemed far away from him now, lost in her thoughts. Outside a market, a boy was perched on a stool, cutting the heads off beans. A barber swept thick tufts of dark hair into one corner of his shop. From an overhead window came music, and Rory craned his neck to catch a glimpse of someone's arm, a lighted cigarette. The familiarity of it all was sweet and painful to him. He searched the dark storefronts for something, some final thing at the core of everything else. but he found just his own reflection and Stacy's. Their eyes met in the glass, then flicked away, and it struck him that this was New York, a place that glittered from a distance, even when you reached it. They climbed the 4 flights of steps to Rory's apartment. A slit of light shone under the door, which meant Charles was back. They found him standing at the kitchen table, wiping a slab of red meat with a paper towel. He had a blowtorch plugged into the wall, and a dismantled smoke alarm lay at his feet. "You poor thing," Stacy said, kissing him on the cheek. "You never stop working." Charles' mouth was like a cat's, small and upturned at the corners. It made him seem happy even when he wasn't. "Meat is my weak point," he said. "I've got a job tomorrow doing steak." He was prematurely balding, and Rory admired the look of hardship and triumph this gave him. Lately, he'd searched his own hairline for signs of recession, but the blonde surfer's mane seemed even more prolific. Most cruel of all, it was Charles, who had been born and raised in Santa Cruz. "Here goes," Charles said, firing up the blowtorch. They watched as he moved the flame slowly over the meat, back and forth as if he were mowing a lawn. Its surface turned a pale gray. When the entire side was done, he flipped the steak over and lightly cooked its other side. "Ugh," Stacy said, "it's still completely raw." "Wait," Charles said. He held a long metal spit to the flame until it glowed red, and then he pressed the spit to the meat. There was a hiss, a smell of cooking, and when he lifted the spit, a long stripe branded the steak. He heated the spit several more times and pressed it to the meat at parallel intervals. Soon it was indistinguishable from a medium rare steak straight off the grill. Rory felt an irrational surge of appetite, a longing to eat the meat in spite of knowing it was raw and cold. Stacy opened the refrigerator. Rory always kept a supply of Cokes for her in there. Diet, of course, but also some regulars in case she had earned one that day and not yet rewarded herself. To his surprise, she pulled out a can of the regular now. "What the hell," she said. "I mean, really, what difference does it make?" Rory stared at her. He had never said anything like this before. "What about Vesuvi?" he asked, regretting it even as he spoke. "Vesuvi won't hire me. You know it perfectly well." She was smiling at him, and Rory felt as if she peered into the lying depths of his soul. "Vesuvi doesn't know shit," he said, but it sounded lame even to himself. Stacy slid open the window and climbed out onto the fire escape. The sky was a strange sulfurous yellow, beautiful yet seemingly disconnected from nature. The shabby tree behind Rory's building was empty of leaves and made a pattern of cracked glass against the sky. Stacy drank her Coke in tiny, careful sips. Rory stood helplessly inside the window watching her. He needed to say something to her. He knew that, but he wasn't sure how. He shook a cigarette from his pack and placed it in his mouth. Charles was working on a second steak. "By the way," Charles said, pointing with his chin to a spot near Rory's head, "I baked a cake, a real one." Rory turned in surprise and lifted a plate from above the refrigerator. It was a tall, elegant cake with giant dollops of whipped cream along its edges. "Charles," Rory said, confused, "haven't you been doing this all week?" "Yeah," Charles said, "but always for strangers and never to eat." He bent over the steak, his blowtorch hissing on the damped meat. He looked embarrassed, as if his preference for real cake was a weakness he rarely confided. Charles' honesty shamed Rory. He said what he felt, not caring how it sounded. Rory climbed out the window and sat beside Stacy. The bars of the fire escape felt cold through his jeans. Stacy held her Coke in one hand and took Rory's hand in the other. They looked at the yellow sky and held hands tightly. as if something were about to happen. Rory's heart beat quickly. So maybe it doesn't work, he said, the modeling. Maybe that just won't happen. He searched her face for some sign of surprise. There was none. She watched him calmly, and for the first time, Rory felt Stacy was older than he, that her mind contained things he knew nothing of. She stood up and handed her coat to Rory. Then she grasped the railing of the fire escape and lifted her body into a handstand. Rory held his breath, watching in an alarmed amazement as the slender wand of her body swayed against the yellow sky. She had no trouble balancing and hovered there for what seemed a long time before finally bending at the waist, lowering her feet, and standing straight again. If it doesn't work, she said, then I'll see the world some other way. She took Rory's face in her hands and kissed him on the mouth, hard, with the fierce, tender urgency of someone about to board a train. Then she turned and looked at the sky. Rory stared at her, oddly frightened to think she would do it. She would find some way. He pictured Stacy in a distant place, looking back on him, on this world of theirs, as if it were a bright, glittering dream she had once believed in. Take me with you, he said.
I can't thank you enough. Those are not easy stories to read, and you did such beautiful jobs with them and did them a lot of credit. And I have got to say, I'm very impressed. Thank you very much, ladies.
Thank you.
Beautiful reading with a lot of care.
Thank you, Janice. And yeah, really interesting stories and surprisingly tough to read. It catches you by surprise when you read them out loud. It's so different from when you're just reading it to yourself and you realize, oh wow, I'm stumbling over things that. But the content and the twists and the plots are really something.
Beautifully written, but they're not what we're necessarily used to in the Roaring Fork Valley.
Well,
but I will say, next month, we're going to have a couple of stories that we might be more used to in the Roaring Fork Valley. We're going to have in June, on Wednesday the 16th, 2 stories by Joe Henry, who lives in Woody Creek and has written a beautiful book of short stories called Lime Creek. And 2 of them will be read by the incomparable Lee Sullivan. And also a story that features a veterinarian will be read by John Cook, who owns Willard's Veterinary Clinic and is a good friend of mine and a very smart man. So we've got some things to look forward to next week. And I can't thank you enough for doing such a beautiful job today. Thank you, ladies, so much. And if any of you people have any sense at all, you will be looking at Thunder River Theater tomorrow night at 7 o'clock for the lovely extravaganza that is going to feature a whole lot of talent and a whole lot of wonder. And please don't overlook Confluence by the Hudson Reed Ensemble, because it's beautiful and there's more to come from that. Thank you, ladies, so much. I look forward to seeing you all next month, and I look forward, as always, to seeing my friend and the most wonderful guy I know, Sean Jeffries, who keeps it all together for us. And thank you to Thunder River, and thank you all. Good night. Sleep well. Don't go to New York. Stay in the Roaring Fork Valley.
Thank you, Janice.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Sean.
Bye.
Bye.